Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So as I've mentioned in earlier videos of mine, one of my early hobbies was actually archery, and I spent a lot of my life shooting arrows, both field archery, target archery, clout archery and so on. No bow hunting. I've never done any bow hunting because unfortunately it's illegal in the UK for historical reasons rather than ethical reasons. Essentially because it was outlawed to prevent poaching in earlier times, and that's never been repealed. Nevertheless, some British people do go bow hunting abroad, but it's not something I've ever done. Something I want to talk about relatively briefly is the creation of medieval style arrows. A few things to mention. I mean, firstly, most people's exposure to arrows, if you've got any exposure to archery at all, will be of modern arrows using usually aluminium or carbon shafts, or occasionally wooden shafts in field archery, but with modern additions to them. We're just going to look at the back end now. This does have a bodkin point on it, but I'm going to talk about arrowheads in the future. This is the back end of a relatively traditionally made, it's not perfect, but a fairly historically made medieval English type of longbow arrow. Now, one thing to mention just about the shafts, incidentally, is that popular woods for modern arrow shafts, at least in the UK, are cedar and ash. Ash is perfectly historical, cedar is not, because of course it's an American wood. I do actually prefer cedar shafts personally, but if you want to be historical you should be using ash or obviously another native wood to Europe. The other thing to mention as well is that modern arrow shafts tend to be the same thickness all the way along. And actually, historically, this was not always the case, and in fact very often not the case, with medieval English arrows. Medieval English arrows often were tapered or barrelled. What I mean by that is they were of varying thickness at different parts of the shaft. Now, there were different types of arrow for different purposes. Some arrows had a thicker region around here, around 1/3 from the point. Some had a thicker region about the mid-point, and some of them had their thickest region up behind the point. The reasons for this are really how you want the arrow to balance and act in the air. So if you want a flight arrow for long distance, my understanding is actually you want its centre of gravity to be a little bit further back. So if you look at Turkish and Persian flight arrows, they're not at all designed for heavy impact with a large head or pile at the front. They're designed purely for distance, and actually they wouldn't be exceptionally effective against lamellar armour, for example, or for depth of penetration for hunting or shooting horses. If you look at medieval English longbow arrows, for example, what remains from the Mary Rose, they tend to be, they're not always, but they tend to be, there's also an arrow, the so-called Westminster Arrow, which was found in Westminster, surprisingly. They tend to be thicker at the pointy end, at the point end, and then taper to the back. And when I say thick at the pointy end, they're often very thick at the pointy end, sort of half-inch thick, and they're really big, beefy arrows. These are war arrows we're talking about, so they've got large, heavy heads on. They're not designed for maximum range, they're designed for maximum impact. My understanding of why they tend to be thick at the pointy end is so that if you watch Thrand, and this is a shout out to Thrand's channel, if you watch Thrand's, one of his latest videos on shooting, a friend of his shooting arrows at a breastplate, you'll notice what happens is the arrowhead snapped off. This is completely normal. In field shooting, I have accidentally, many times, hit trees. And what normally happens when an arrow hits a tree, unlike in the movies where it goes in there and shudders and goes dong, that does happen sometimes, but what usually happens is the arrow hits the tree, there's usually a slight angle, all of the force goes sideways because you usually hit the tree at a very slight angle, you're not usually at exactly 90 degrees, and what happens is the shaft usually snaps about here and the back end of the arrow flies off somewhere. Okay, so usually if you hit a hard target like a tree or a breastplate, what happens is the top part of the shaft snaps off. Therefore, all of the momentum that was in that arrow is lost because the arrow is shot off over there. So you're losing a big chunk of your energy, all of those joules of energy that your bow has put into this arrow, and the arrow's travelled across distance, losing a bit of the energy, and when it arrives at the target, if it snaps, a whole chunk of that energy you put into the arrow flies off somewhere else. You don't want that. If you're hitting someone's mail, or helmet, or whatever you're hitting, laminar armour, horse, bare body, whatever you're hitting with your war arrow, you want as much of that energy as possible to go into the target. Therefore, if you strengthen the part of the shaft which is most likely to snap, and which we see in all sorts of scenarios, that is the bit that snaps. If you strengthen that, so if you thicken the shaft up here, you're achieving two things at the same time. Firstly, you're increasing the momentum of the arrow, you're increasing its mass, remember m times v, so mass times velocity, you're increasing the total mass, and of course you're putting a heavy arrowhead on the front there as well. But additionally you're strengthening it, you're structurally reinforcing the region that's most likely to snap when it hits a resistive target. So there's the shaft. The shaft on medieval English arrows and Tudor English arrows tend to be thicker at the front and then taper towards the back. This also of course gives you a desirable point of balance, and potentially means if you're shooting, if you're arcing shots into a ship or over a wall or whatever, you're going to get the drop at the front of the arrow sooner, hopefully. With distance arrows you might actually want the arrow to be going through the air slightly like that, so to an extent it's almost getting a gliding effect. Now, looking at the back of the arrow, there are some major differences between the fletchings of a medieval type arrow and a modern fletchings or flights. First up, they tend to be very long. Now, there are many questions about why this is the case, and I don't think anyone 100% can say with certainty the answer. My personal theory is that often when you shoot an arrow, when it comes out of the bow, because it is travelling around the bow, it kicks out at the back. So when you watch slow motion arrows being shot, they tend to do this and then stabilise. If you have larger fletchings, I believe the arrow stabilises quicker. So it stabilises in a shorter distance away from the bow. So therefore it might be, and this is only one of many possible theories, I'm not saying this is correct, it might be that long fletchings mean that your arrow straightens sooner out of the bow, and that's very desirable in war, because many times you'll be drawing the arrow and shooting, and you might be shooting at someone who's really quite close, and you want that arrow to be travelling straight when it hits them, because if it's travelling sideways, either way, because it will oscillate, it will do this when it comes out of the bow, if it hits them and it's like that, what will happen is exactly what I mentioned before with the tree, the arrow will do this. So the energy won't go into the target, it will be taken off in another direction. So long fletchings, they're traditionally made of goose feathers. We do read accounts in the 14th, 15th and 16th centuries of other types of feather being used. Peacock was apparently popular. I don't know whether peacock is particularly good or whether it's just because it looked pretty. This is in reference mostly to target arrows, so it could have just been because they liked the look of it, or it might be because peacocks have a certain type of feather, probably on their wings I guess, that's particularly good for arrows. I don't know. Goose fletchings, however, were the main form of military arrow fletching in medieval England, and Henry V, prior to the Agincourt campaign in 1415, famously required that every goose in England have a feather taken from it to make arrows. And arrows, it's very important to mention as well, see, at least in England, were like ammunition in later periods. They were a state created and supplied commodity. They were produced at the Tower of London amongst other places, and they were transported as an official military product to be used by the king's soldiers. So there is a thing called a standard livery arrow, which is used in modern warbow archery, which is supposed to simulate one of these standard arrows. And incidentally also, for those of you who know about British militaria, you'll know that the symbol of the War Department and the Board of Ordnance before that was an arrowhead, and that's where it comes from. It comes from the fact that arrows were one of the first major centrally produced armaments for the Army of England. And now looking at the back end, I'll mention this thread in a minute, but now at the back end you'll notice that the nock is what we call a self-wooden nock. That means, quite simply, it's a groove cut in the shaft. A modern arrow usually has a plastic nock at the back, which is an additionally glued on piece. Plastic nocks are very strong, very good, they fit the string very well. Wooden nocks, not so good, but they didn't have plastic nocks in medieval England. Now this is a very simple one where simply the groove is cut into the shaft, and then thread is put around at the bottom of that groove to prevent the nock splitting during use. Okay, so that binding is really there just to make that nock stronger. Better quality arrows than this, more expensive arrows than this, would have a sliver of horn put in at 90 degrees. So you can see that the groove goes this way, the horn sliver would be inserted that way. So what you essentially end up with then is a sliver of horn with the nock cut out of it. And horn's quite similar to plastic actually. So horn's kind of like the naturally produced plastic. So by having it at a 90-degree angle, so if the nock's in there, the sliver of horn would go in that way. You have a reinforced nock, and you then don't need that thread. The other thread here is really binding the fletchings to the shaft, and it seems that they did probably glue the fletchings on, but for extra security, because you didn't want your fletchings becoming dislodged or anything else, because they're very important towards the arrow doing what you want it to do, you then bound with usually linen thread at the front and the back of the fletching, and also at intervals through like that. So there we go guys, a sort of introduction to medieval English longbow arrows. They were usually tapered, sometimes barrelled, in other words sometimes they were thicker here, but usually they were thicker at the front. We won't talk about arrowheads at the moment. Usually the wood of the shaft was things like ash, but long grained woods, but obviously European woods and not cedar. The fletchings were usually long, usually goose, usually bound on, probably as well as glued, and the nocks were either simple wooden notch or with horn reinforcement. Cheers guys! Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and feel free to follow us on Facebook.